Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And we are here today, Friday, so the day of the election results. Now, we don't have a lot of election results in.
No.
We've got some. We've got the Runcorn by-election, which Reform has won by 6 votes, unbelievably. But we will talk a little bit more in detail and we'll sort of analyse those election results next week. But for today, we're joined by a guest, Tanya de Grunwald. I hope I've said that correctly. Tanya is an HR commentator and a podcaster. She hosts the podcast This Isn't Working. So good morning, Tanya. And firstly, what isn't working?
Hi there. Shorter list of what is working in HR at the moment, frankly. I've been kind of working in a sort of DEI HR adjacent role for the last sort of 10 years or so, and no one's been very interested in us. And suddenly everyone's talking about HR and kind of what's gone wrong. So I guess I'm probably quite well placed to explain a bit about how we got where we are now, why we've got these problems coming up that we're seeing that suddenly everybody wants to talk about.
Yes, and HR is one of those areas, isn't it, where you kind of think at one point it was there to help businesses, and it kind of feels it hinders businesses a lot these days.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say diplomatically that it's somewhat lost its way. And I think in doing that, that's why employees are seeing the problems that they're seeing, is because the employers are in a mess. And I think they've got distracted by various fads and things, of which DEI is one, of which well-being is another. There may be some good bits of DEI, which we can talk about, or good bits of what we're now calling DEI. Maybe they shouldn't really be under that heading, I'm not sure. And things like well-being. And so I think HR generally is attracting a strange mix of people now, including quite a lot of activists who I think they're probably bringing too many of their own politics to work, to be honest. And I think people are drawn to this career, particularly a lot of women, and they want to make the world a better place. They're those sorts of people, and they've all got very good intentions, but they sort of think that the HR's role is to make the world of work a nicer place and to make everybody happy at work, which is quite different from what a lot of the more old school HR people will say, who you could see as the more sensible people, who are like, well, hang on a minute, this is called human resources, right? And I think in the corporate world, they're much clearer about the fact that your people are a great asset to your organization, but you hire them, you fire them, and they are there to be productive. And the point at which you're veering away from productivity, frankly, and you're risking things like retention if you've got people leaving because of how badly you're behaving as an employer. I think particularly around things like free speech, freedom of belief, things like that. You're then risking your own workforce, you're risking them leaving, or you're risking them staying and just like switching off a bit and just disengaging a bit. You've got more people working from home, particularly older people, because they're like, I just don't really like this workplace anymore. So if I can work from home, say you're doing a professional job, you think, well, I'll do that because it's all a bit woke in the office and I don't really get it. And everyone's a bit, I just, it's not as fun as it was. The banter's gone. So you've got kind of a strange mix really going on in the workplace at the moment. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, the mention of the word productivity, I can sort of see Hilary's smile from the corner of my eye. But before we get into it too much, because I think you've already alluded to a lot of the really interesting points about this area. Before we do that, just tell us a little bit about you and how you got involved in this and how you ended up running a podcast.
Okay, so I actually worked in women's magazines for years and years. So I graduated in 2000 and I spent the next 10 years writing for Glamour and Grazia and Cosmo and stuff. I wrote a lot of stuff about dating and stuff, in fact. Thank God that's not online.
You're the first person who said that to us in a podcast, Tanya.
Yeah, so I come from, I guess, quite a sort of kind of fluffy background, really. So, I used to write funny stuff and some fashion stuff and some celeb stuff. I did that for 10 years. And then I wrote a book about graduate jobs. Which was kind of like the sort of guide that I think I needed because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I left university. And that was good, but I mean, writing a book is a commercial disaster always, I think. But that kind of made me an expert in this field. I then started a website called Graduate Fog, which is still going actually, and I use it from time to time, but less now. And I was basically I was doing a lot of work, that was around 2010, particularly naming and shaming people that had unpaid interns. So I named and shamed Tony Blair, Simon Cowell, Philip Green, Vivienne Westwood, may she rest, but she didn't pay her interns. And so I was kind of known in a way for championing, I guess, good jobs for young people. And I think I became very aware. I mean, my personal background is quite comfortable, and I did work for free for a little bit before I got into magazines. But I think I had noticed how much that was changing, and how much people weren't just doing, a couple of weeks at various different mags before they got a permanent job, which is kind of what happened to me actually, was freelancing. But there wasn't, it didn't go on for months and months. It certainly didn't go on for years of working for free. And so I noticed that there were lots of young people who were still working for nothing in order to try and kind of get the experience you needed to get your first job. So unpaid internships kind of created a new layer of kind of pre-job, which seemed really unfair to me. I mean, it is really unfair. And it was also really bad for business, as it turns out. And funnily enough, although I didn't think it was going to be relevant to any of the work I'm doing now, I think some of the industries that have gone really bad in terms of particularly the kind of freedom of speech stuff and the sort of I don't really use the word woke usually, but hyper woke stuff are the industries that have also been worse for unpaid internships, which I don't think is a coincidence. So sort of publishing and places like that, you see it kind of coming through. We can get back to that. So I was doing all that work on kind of good jobs for young people, which brought me to thinking about social mobility. And then at the same time as actually the bigger employers were switching their brains on to what we now call DEI, or whatever we're calling it, DEIB, they've added the belonging.
I've not heard of this. DEIB.
Yeah.
There's always another letter gets added in these things.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think the problem with DEI is that there's not enough letters. I don't know about you guys. I don't think that was what we were missing.
So for anybody
I think we're missing some evidence.
For anybody that doesn't know, what does DEI stand for?
Diversity, equity and inclusion. But at the time it was called diversity and inclusion. The E kind of sneaked in later.
And tell us about the B. The B is...
That's belonging. You'll have to get a different guest on to talk about what's going on there. By that, I don't belong in this industry anymore.
Feels like it's calling out for a DEIB plus.
Yeah, I really don't think that's what we need. I don't think we need any more letters. I don't think that's the problem. So I guess I saw... This is the bit where I differ, I think, from a lot of people who talk about this stuff, is that I saw some of the good stuff, really. So I saw how the good employers were like, you know what, Tanya, you were right about the unpaid internships thing. You're right that it's unfair, but it's also really bad business because we're actually strangling our kind of talent pipeline because all these great young people who could be brilliant and frankly better than some of the slightly dopey, overeducated kids who went to private school, like we're missing out on this amazing talent. So why would we do that when we don't need to? And actually, for the big corporations, you're not, just to save a few quid on a few, it's not a big expense to pay your interns. So they really switched on that. And then they also started realizing, things like, do you give the internships to somebody who's, or do you give an internship to somebody who's the child of a client or the child of the boss, and all of that kind of stuff about the importance of contacts, but also confidence as well. And again, as someone who's benefited from private school, I suddenly became really aware of what a big plus it is to turn up to an interview and have that confidence and not be intimidated. Well, it's a bit intimidating always going to these big kind of shiny buildings and things, but how, particularly for professional jobs, if that's not your background, if your parents haven't got a professional background, how much harder it is, to then do a great interview when you're already thinking, oh God, I'm not sure I did that thing right on the way in, and maybe I said the wrong thing. And, there's so much more on your mind. So I think I became, much more aware of that, which I still stand by. And so I guess I saw how things began to change from that point onwards. And that's when employers began to come to me and say, what are you doing and how can we work together? And I set up a club called the Good and Fair Employers Club, which was for the head of early careers, which is the person that does graduates and apprenticeships at lots of big companies. So like Santander, Vodafone, GSK, Google, Accenture, Clifford Chance, NHS, and I was working with them, and they're great. They're still great, but DEI was kind of part of the conversations that we had when I brought them together. But they were really doing the recruitment stuff for graduates and apprentices, which is tricky stuff. So it's actually great to have that forum for them to be able to talk to each other. So I've basically been sitting on the sidelines. I ran that club from 2018 to December just gone, 2024. I've just closed it, well, paused it, we'll see. And I ended up sitting there watching. I was there at the exact time when all of this DEI stuff, some of it good, some of it bad, was all coming in. So suddenly my experience is proving to be quite interesting to people. I didn't really realize at the time it was going to turn out to be so interesting to people, to be honest. But it's nice.
It's interesting. A lot of things you say, there's a real equivalence in the political world. So the political world can be quite incestuous, and people tend to appoint, it's a bit jobs for the boys. They tend to appoint people they know. So it's definitely not just in business that happens. And I think you're right that there's a real tendency, I think, now when we say DEI, for us to kind of roll our eyes and think, oh, not that again. But there are some really important things that are still a problem in workplaces. So the one that you mentioned there, you didn't quite mention it by name, is class. Is the fact that, getting a good mix of working class people in the workplace is really important, and that seems to have been forgotten by DEI.
Yeah.
So how does that happen when you say that? So I think what you were saying earlier was that there's a lot of kind of be kind people in the HR field who do want to do the right thing, but why did they just not see the class issue at all?
Well, they would say that they do. I mean, and they don't totally ignore it, and they don't totally ignore disability either, which again, I think those two are the most popular generally with the public, in terms of things they actually want their employer to make more effort on. They would say they don't ignore it. So they actually, they do quite a lot of outreach work to, say, universities where they know that it's young people from all different backgrounds, for example. So they're not actually desperately keen to go to all the sort of smarter universities anymore. So they would say that they're doing that. I think that the bad bits of it definitely overshadow the good bits of it. And I don't think they have prioritized correctly. I think that's definitely true. The measurable stuff tends to be things like race and also sex. So that's sort of what they've kind of focused on. But they would say that they do work quite hard, this is the big firms particularly, on thinking about things like, we talked endlessly during COVID about how difficult it was for people from different backgrounds to be able to find somewhere quiet to do a Zoom call where they had good connections, a good, internet connection. To be able to do it, and they might have a sibling in the other room, and you shouldn't penalise them for this. So they are quite thoughtful about that kind of stuff. So I don't think that's totally fair. I know you weren't having a go, but I don't think that's totally fair. I think the other stuff has overshadowed it. I think particularly what they would call LGBT, particularly what they would call trans inclusion, has overshadowed an awful lot of other stuff. And I think the spend and the time spent on those issues has been disproportionate. And so what I'm hoping is that we will start to see a rebalancing there. And I have to say that if I were a campaigner on disability or social mobility class, as you would say, I would be sharpening my elbows, because I would be saying, right, hey, do you remember how you totally forgot us when you lost your marbles over all this other stuff? Well, we're still here, and actually we're a much better investment than some of this other stuff you've been doing, which was either performative or divisive or both. How is that? When I look at the amount of money they've spent, on things like Pride, and some of it's, it's fine to do some stuff on this, but when I look at the sort of 6-week celebration, because it's not just June, it goes into July, but actually July is supposed to be Disability Month as well. Not as well. It's meant to be Disability Month, and that's it. But there's so little thought to it that it's actually, every year I just think this is so embarrassing, that this is so disproportionate. Like, why is no one embarrassed about this? So I just think
how is this happening? So these are companies that are deciding to put a lot of resources and time into celebrating Pride.
Yes. Yeah. And doing things like meeting Stonewall diversity champions targets and things like that.
What is what's challenging about this then? Because I personally would say, that there shouldn't be any expectation to do that. But if a company decides that's what they want to do, that's their prerogative. I personally don't like it. I don't think it's something we should be celebrating as such. But that's up to people. If they want to celebrate it, crack on. What's controversial about that?
I think it's disproportionate. And I think what we've done is we've strangled conversation and the ability to actually say that there is a competition for resources here. Employers are not going to spend endless money on endless awareness training for endless groups. So everybody that we give some time to, everybody that we give some money to, effectively we're taking it away from someone else. And the disability groups particularly are, I don't want to say squeamish, but they're nervous about doing that, particularly as there are a lot of people who like the pride stuff in the disability community. But there's a squeamishness about saying, are we prioritizing the right thing here? Because there is a competition between these groups for resources. And I think we need to have that conversation. And actually, some of the disability advocates, my friend George Fielding, who I had on the podcast recently, he said it. He's a wheelchair user, and the response was somewhat mixed. I think it was important to at least start that conversation. I mean, you can't spend endless money on stuff. So are you sure that doing a lot of stuff on race, for example, I mean, some stuff on all this stuff is fine. I don't think people object. But when it's disproportionate and when it becomes divisive and when it doesn't reflect your workforce properly, and if there's something about it that doesn't sit well with their politics as well, it starts to feel like you're actually doing more harm than good, in which case, what the hell are you doing?
And I think the other thing that Tanya mentioned earlier about the effect it has on kind of free speech in the workplace. So if you're in a workplace that's very switched on to all these pride things, and perhaps for religious reasons, you actually disagree as an individual with some of that, and perhaps somebody puts a card in front of you to sign for a same-sex marriage, and you kind of feel, I don't want to sign that because my religious beliefs say that that's not right. Now, if you're in with that kind of a workplace, I expect that not to go down very well. And there's more, there's trickier options. So, collection comes round because somebody's having a sex change and they need to fund it themselves and you refuse to put in it. And I think a lot of those things are actually quite divisive in a workplace.
Yeah, I mean, my company that I worked for before, they were trying to sell us pride shirts with the name of the company on. And I just think it's completely, it's self-serving. I think that's the thing that I really dislike about it. And I remember my colleague who I worked in my office with, who was gay, he just said, I'm so fed up with this. It's like how patronising. And that's so to me, I don't necessarily see it as such a controversial thing. I see it as sort of as pretty like an easy answer, which is companies should stop doing this. And I don't know, maybe there is an alternative, and I think or an alternative sort of middle ground, because something that Hilary and I are sort of keen to really prioritise discussion about is searching for that sensible middle ground often when you get the conversation. I think nowadays, partly because of social media, and you're incentivized to sort of put out quite an extreme viewpoint. Something like DEI, I think we're hearing from quite the sort of polarized ends of the spectrum, and so I'm keen if there's if there's good reasons for it, and I'm sure you both would say that it started with good intentions. I'm sort of keen to hear those reasons.
Yeah, we need to pick through the detail of it. That's what I'm doing at the moment. So to see what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff. So, I mean, I've actually been talking about this for about 2.5 years now, quite clearly on LinkedIn, which is my main platform, and saying, look, if we don't decide what I was calling good DEI and bad DEI, so things like having a decent maternity policy, right?
Yeah.
Is that DEI? Or is that just a good plan because you want to hang on to your female staff when they have a baby? I mean, meaning people can go and pick their kids up from school, if they're ill, having certain provisions for disability, not having unpaid internships and knowing exactly why you're not having unpaid internships. That, there is some good stuff there. And I actually think some of the race stuff is completely fair enough as well. I think it's fair enough to think about, if you're not white and you go to an assessment centre and everybody there is super white and you just feel like a bit, would it be nicer to make sure that on the reception desk, for example, you've got a slightly better mix of people, for example, for anybody who's maybe feeling a little bit nervous and out of place? And it might be a race thing, or it just might be a kind of friendliness thing, or I don't want to dismiss that as being there's no difference at all and that we shouldn't think about these things at all. And I do think if you've got I mean, I differ with, had a conversation, I don't know if you know James Esses, he's quite big on all this stuff. And he said, well, he's a commentator in this area. He said, well, if there's a panel at an event that's just all white men, it just means that, the white men are the best people for the panel. And I was like, does it? Or does it raise questions like, what is it about this industry, whatever this panel is doing? Why aren't there any women there? Why is everybody white? Will be actually, and is the audience going to get a really good mix of views? I don't know. Maybe they are, because maybe these people all have completely different social backgrounds. But I just think it's reasonable to ask a question. And that's actually why DEI came in, is because that really, there is something about seeing, the photo of the board and everybody's white and male. There is something about that. And there is something about the mistakes that some of these companies were making when they weren't thinking about that sort of diversity at all. There were some real clangers. And I'm thinking of the example of H&M, the retailer, who put a little, there was a t-shirt, there was a kids catalogue thing, a kids shoot, and there was a little boy who was wearing a t-shirt which said the naughtiest monkey in the jungle, and he was black. Now, you need somebody at H&M to say, not that child, not that t-shirt.
Yeah.
And not to put it on posters all around the UK and wait for someone to go, what? No. And I don't know what went wrong there. I mean, I've got a few theories on what might have gone wrong there, but you could say that sort of thing really spooked employers and made them think, actually, that's really bad. We shouldn't have, that's clearly a mistake. How did we let that happen? So there were moments like that, and I think it was, when Beyonce was looking for somebody for which company to partner with for some new, I think some sports fashion range she was doing, I think I might going to get this wrong. She either I think she went with Nike in the end because Reebok, it was Nike, Adidas and Reebok. Anyway, whoever she rejected, the story goes that she rejected them because there was no one who looked like her in the marketing meeting that she went to. And so, and I'm not sure she's ever actually confirmed this herself, but that sort of myth sprung up that you're out of touch with your customers. That kind of, it's awful, that pale male stale thing, which I think is awful. But that was the sort of thing that was being said at the time. And it really had an impact on employers. And they were like, we want to look like we're like modern and we are, inclusive and all these sorts of things. And there didn't seem like a downside to it. It's now become really clear that if you overdo it, there is a big downside to it. But it wasn't as clear at the time. I guess you'll just have to take my word for it on that.
So I think you're absolutely right. When you walk into a room or you look at the board of a particular company and you see it's all white men, I think you're absolutely right to say, why would that have happened? If they're wanting the best people for these jobs, which they should be, why is it that they've ended up with the same demographic, let's say? I think that's perfectly adequate. And then you could look at your policies to see if they're particularly discriminating against one group. I think that's really
No,
good.
it's not just about discrimination. It's also about pipeline. That's another mistake people make, if you don't mind me saying.
Go on.
That where are the people who should have been applying for the job? So it's not just about, you're seeing the job, if I'm understood you correctly, and maybe I haven't because I interrupted you. But the idea that a job is a prize that people are just competing for, and you just like open the gates and off they go, you haven't thought about where are all these people coming from and how early on did they deselect themselves from this process? So, for example, women in science, women in STEM, right? Why aren't there more women in those careers? And why aren't there many black women particularly? They're very, very thin on the ground. Now, the reason why there aren't is nothing to do with discrimination. It's to do with pipeline, which is that we are not presenting those careers to enough of these girls, frankly, in primary school. And there are reasons why they are put off them throughout school. And there are reasons why they choose other subjects, probably for lower paying jobs in the end, when actually they would have been great scientists.
So yeah,
so
I think
that's more the sort of way of looking at it.
You're looking at it from a much more sort of overarching perspective. Yeah. I'm talking specifically just about a company. If you're a small company, you don't have the benefit of looking at it from that perspective. So I'm just saying what a company should probably be doing if they're looking at their board and seeing that it's all white men. Where I disagree is that I think if that let's say a black person goes into a job and it's the room is full of white men and they're questioning that and they're saying, there's nobody that looks like me. My criticism would be with those that make race an issue, because I don't think it should ever be a question. I don't think it should be something that we're thinking about on a daily basis, where we're judging ourselves and others on the colour of our skin.
I think there is a middle ground here, Sebastian. So I think the thing that I always get uncomfortable about is when people think that if the board isn't 50% women because the population is 50% women, that means that there's some level of discrimination. And I think that's just completely wrong. You know, that the automatic assumption that a lack of proportionality means discrimination, I think is wrong. But at the same time, I think if you're in one of those situations, and Tanya, you come up with very glamorous stories about Beyonce, I will do a much less glamorous story about financial services industry, where, you know, often I think you find that kind of thing happens because you're in board meetings, for example, they're not properly chaired. So everybody talks over each other. Nobody ever makes space for women to talk. And certainly, as a woman, don't say that very often, but, you know, I often with those kind of meetings, I would just say, it's not for me. So there are ways in which organisations, and discriminate is probably not quite the right word, but there are ways in which organisations make it difficult for certain parts of their workforce to progress, which are not, I don't think, done consciously. Nobody's thinking, we won't chair the meeting properly because then the women won't speak. But they're not thinking about the fact that because we don't chair it properly, women don't speak. So I do think there are, going back to your point, Tanya, about what do you rescue from all this? I think it's not that you say, you know, we want 50% women here, there, or anywhere. It's that you say, well, if we've not got that, let's just make sure there's nothing that is standing in as barriers in their way. Is that not the right approach?
Yeah, I think, I mean, all this conversation is a conversation that we should have had when we started DEI, frankly.
Yes.
Which is, what the hell are we trying to achieve here? Are we working towards a world where 50% of beauticians are men? And if not, why not? Like, what are we doing here? What are we doing? So, and I think, you know, are we going for, you know, exact representation of the population, whether it's LGBT, whether it's men and women, whether it's race, whatever it is? Are we looking for exact representation in every organization according to the population? Because then there are differences, you know, around around the UK, for example. So when you find yourself trying to, you know, desperately hire some people who there aren't many people of that race in that part of the country, just so you can get your numbers up, and you're thinking, wait a second, I think we've got this wrong.
Yes.
So I think all these questions are really valid. I don't think there are any easy answers to them all, and I think we need to find out where the line is. I feel like it's important that people are sort of saying, let's get rid of DEI and return to meritocracy. I've got a problem with return to meritocracy because we know what happens if we don't do anything to adjust for any of these groups who feel a bit less confident or a bit less welcome. We know what happens, which is that, you know, the people that are really good at being assessed, frankly, to get the jobs. They're not necessarily the best people for the jobs. They're not necessarily the best long-term hire for that organization. They're just the best at interviews, right? So, you know, this is really tricky territory, and frankly, we should have looked at all of it before we started it. And if we weren't going to do that, we should certainly have put in guardrails or kind of roadblocks so that we could check at every stage, hang on a second, is this still working? Name of my podcast, this isn't working. We could have gone, wait, this isn't working. Or are we starting to lose support? So, for example, when organizations had even a whiff of a feeling that the larger workforce were not on board with some of the DEI stuff that they were doing, whether it's recruitment or whether it's culture for people that already work there, they should have gone, oh, hang on a minute. Are we saying our workforce is wrong? Is it more likely that we are wrong? And I don't think they did enough of that self-reflection. And some of that is because the sort of people who are attracted to these sorts of careers tend to be from a very particular political persuasion. I have never met a DEI person who voted for Brexit. I've never met a DEI person who voted, you know, Tory, let alone Reform. So you know, I'm conscious of the day that we're speaking, and you know, I pay attention to this stuff as you know, I'm sure you do as well. That this part of your business, if you're a big organization particularly, you're not ready for the rise of the right wing, which I think we're going to see, and you probably do too, because you've got a bunch of pretty left-leaning people in your HR department who I see them on LinkedIn all the time saying, they were horrified that Trump won. First of all, they were surprised, which I don't think anybody should have been if they were paying attention. And the second thing was they were also really open about how horrified they were. And I'm like, wow, okay. So you think this is HR people who should be the quietest about this stuff because all of your staff might be seeing it and thinking, well, I quite like Trump, or well, Musk's, he's a bit of an arse, but whatever. Some people like these people, and a lot of men like these people, and a lot of young men like these people. And so HR is becoming this sort of mumsy kind of lefty mumsy crowd, which is really risking becoming out of step with some of their workforce. And it's particularly obvious in, it depends on your workforce, but if you've got quite a young male workforce, for example, you're probably less likely to have gone too crazy with this stuff because you will have felt immediately that it wasn't landing very well. So whereas in places like publishing, it's gone a bit nuts because everybody was kind of into it. Your workforce were into it just as much as the HR people were into it, in which case there was nothing at all to stop it going bananas. And I think that's kind of what we've seen, really. I would say, though, that, it is a complete mess, but I don't think it's a conspiracy. I just believe that this is a story as much about good intentions gone bad and just a failure to stop it. And also it is about activists, because a lot of activists have come into the workforce. They wouldn't see themselves as activists, but I think it's pretty clear that they are. The motivations of these people is not really political. I mean, a lot of people think it is, but they're not. I don't. I think it's deeply, deeply personal with most of these people. Okay, so I sit in on quite a lot of the webinars and meetings and things that they have because I think it's fascinating and it's a very interesting group of people. They don't sit around quoting like Marxist texts or even like any of the sort of new nutty race people. They don't do that. They talk about themselves. They talk about their own difficult childhood. They were adopted. They're the child of a single mum. And it's usually something difficult. Their dad was in prison, whatever it was. And, the main thing is that they were bullied at school. What I think you're seeing is an awful lot of grown adults now in professional jobs who had a bit of a tough start in life. Lots of people had a tough start in life and don't behave like this later in life, but whatever. Yeah. I think these are people who frankly should have had some therapy in their 20s and didn't. And now they're taking it out on the rest of us in our 40s, frankly. There's an awful lot of that. And it's really striking how much they talk about themselves, and the weaponization of your own lived experience is really the power of that to shut up any dissent before it's even happened. Like there's a chilling effect. So the minute someone says what a difficult childhood they had, you can't disagree with anything they say about anything because they've created this. It's very strange. It's like they're all under a spell. There's something a bit spooky about it sometimes, but they're all into it. And that's the reason why I think we're seeing such shock after the Supreme Court ruling as well. And probably after today, depending on how the vote all goes, is that the echo chamber effect is very, very real. We knew that, but it is bigger and more frightening actually than I realized it was. It's really noticeable how many people have not spoken to anyone who disagrees with them since like 2019. Yeah, apparently. Really is.
Can I ask two questions? So, sorry. The first is just when you said nobody stopped them, you might imagine that owners and managers and directors of businesses might have kind of stepped in and said, is this the right path to be going down? And perhaps just in my head, the two things that kind of reasons why they didn't is, first of all, they thought they were asking the experts to do it, either by, consultants or HR people. And secondly, I do think there's this kind of almost chilling hand of the NEDs, the non-executive directors, who do the same thing in every workplace. So that's my first question is why did nobody stop it? And perhaps the second question, because after all, this is Bring Me Solutions. How do we get out of here? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, why didn't it get stopped? I mean, the leadership thing, if you're talking about HR directors, it seems that they didn't, it's not, like DEI is not a huge part of HR, right? And the trans thing is not a huge part of DEI. So if we're talking about the trans thing particularly, because I just mentioned the Supreme Court ruling, it just isn't that big a part of what they do. And when they're worrying about like workforce planning and all sorts of other stuff that they're doing, I mean, they're doing a lot of redundancies at the moment, might be making themselves redundant, who knows? Like the DEI thing was always, I mean, in lots of organizations, lots of corporations particularly, it just wasn't seen as being that important. And so they were bringing in trainers particularly who were not qualified. They didn't do proper due diligence on them. And they should have said, hang on a second, who are these people? But there's a kind of circuit of these trainers. And once you've done like Barclays, you can then get into Amazon, you can then get into Deliveroo, and everybody, because you've done such and such before, that's how there's a sort of credentialism, that's not quite the right word, is it? But there's a sort of, there's a sort of social proof or whatever of saying, well, they must be okay because they've done Barclays.
Yeah.
You don't know who that person was at Barclays and if they checked at all. And so you're then relying on the people who attended the session to go, that person was a bit crazy. I'm not sure about some of that stuff. And people don't. They just go, well, that was weird. But they don't tend to feed back because they know that it won't go down very well. So there's no quality control around any of that. And the leadership bit was like, a lot of this stuff came in kind of around COVID as well, a little bit before then. But COVID was so crazy for HR. They were dealing with working from home. They were dealing with all sorts. And the BLM, George Floyd was obviously 2020.
Yeah.
That all came in as well. And they kind of, people at that age were dealing with all of that stuff, trying to do an apprenticeship scheme during a pandemic. I know how difficult that was, or get a sense of it, because that's what my members were doing. But they were doing that. They weren't thinking, are we sure that people with all different beliefs, feel that they can say our training's a bit nutty if they don't want it, if they don't like it? They're probably not. They're also at the age where they've probably got elderly parents, then they've probably got young children. And they were like, I don't really get this pronoun thing, but whatever, the young people seem to be into it, it's no big deal. So they let it kind of run away with itself. The question about more senior leadership when you go up to board level, I've had those questions too, because I don't really understand as much about that level, but I did an interview with a chap called Paul Sweeney, who's been on boards, and he was explaining how basically boards don't work. He's just like this kind of illusion of corporate governance, which is just a bunch of people who get really well paid for taking as little responsibility as they possibly can, as far as I can see. And that episode was called Are Activist CEOs Out of Control? But it was kind of about how he's basically like, think of all the big companies that have collapsed in the last 10, 20 years. They all had boards. Like, clearly boards don't work because the board doesn't find out until too late that there's a problem because it's too removed from the business itself.
Yep.
So we then begin to see how this is like not just one, a few things that have gone wrong. This is like, I started a list originally of like, how did we get here? And I started with like A to Z, and I'm in like Roman numerals. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And there's been a lack of leadership within HR. So the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development is the HR industry body. Seems to me that it's not fit for purpose. So it is supposed to be leading, but it's a bit like Stonewall or WPath for people that are following the trans stuff. It's like it's the incumbent, but it's just taking up space because it's not actually leading. It's very unpopular, but it's kind of got this monopoly, and it exerts this sort of dominance, and it behaves like it's a leader. But we see, we've seen the CIPD. For example, their trans inclusion guidance has been a complete disaster, and it only came out in 2023, which was like 5 years too late, in my opinion. And it had immediate pushback from lawyers, from Sex Matters, and they left it there for a year and a bit. So that went in to all these organizations. All of that bad advice went into people's policies between 2023 and 2024. Then they put out some slightly better guidance in 2024, but they never said to their members, by the way, you should shred that last one that we did in 2023 because it was bad, and you need to go back and unpick your policy. They didn't do that. And so now we've had the Supreme Court ruling, which shouldn't have been a surprise to them, but basically their guide basically implied in some places that self-ID was the way to go, and people can use whichever toilets they want. So it's not surprising now that we see this huge confusion, because the employers didn't know what the law was, let alone what it's now being. They didn't have it right before. So there should just be a little clarification. But because they've been taking advice from the industry body, which has also failed them, as has the industry press, discussion has just died. That's not just in HR, that's everywhere. The industry press used to be the place where people would say, oh God, what's happened to this person's really screwed this up. How did that happen? Let's do some analysis. They don't do that anymore.
No.
So that's what I'm trying to bring back is like, even if the person that screwed it up isn't going to talk about what went wrong, other people should be saying, how did the RAF, for example, who did a massive boo-boo with some of their hiring,
Yeah.
that was that was proper positive discrimination and they really screwed it up. There should have been so much discussion about that. It was such a mistake. But there wasn't.
And to be fair to employers, if you're an employer and you've got some HR people and you're thinking, how do I develop these people? The CIPD is where you send them to get credentialised and trained and there's not an alternative, is there? That's just where they go.
No, I know, but they're not being an alternative is not a good reason to keep using an organisation that is not fit for purpose. I mean, an HR director said to me the other day that she'd interviewed somebody who was CIPD qualified who couldn't name the 9 protected characteristics. I mean, I can name them. You guys can probably name them. You have a pretty good go.
I think even Sebastian could do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And this is CIPD qualified people. I had another HR director who said that he thought that less than 10% of HR and DEI people understand the Equality Act.
Oh, gosh.
Like understand the basics of how it works. So if we're looking at a collapse in standards, I think that is what we're looking at. I think we need to talk about how this has gone wrong, and we need to stop giving this organisation any more power to put any more bad advice into any more organisations. Like they've got this. Sorry, I'm on a roll now.
You are.
I really don't like this.
We're going to bring you back to solutions in a minute.
It bugs me because it's such an important role. The chief executive is really, really well paid. He's a guy called Peter Cheese. That is his actual name. And he gets paid $300,000 a year. And as far as I can see, HR is in a real mess. And I don't know how that's okay for somebody to be in that role and to have made such a mess of such an important job.
Yeah.
I guess that's why it bugs me. I mean,
so solutions.
I'm actually coming to this. All right. I'm coming to solutions. So solutions are we need to start talking. Yeah. That's my solution. I'm a journalist, whatever. I'm interested in the workplace. I'm not an HR person. I've never had an HR job. I'm very good at getting conversations moving, and I think they have the solutions themselves. And to get them talking to each other about, okay, what's happened here? Where did we go wrong? Is any of this stuff good? We need to go back and unpick it. How do we go back and tell our employees that we've got this a bit wrong? How do we reset expectations? Lots of people don't even really understand like what having a job is, particularly younger people, that they sort of think that their employer is some sort of pseudo parent or something who's responsible for your well-being and that you love every second of your work. I mean, this is more in professional jobs really, but something's gone really wrong there and needs to be corrected, I think.
Yes, yeah. And so that you're saying effectively it's industries and organisations that need to kind of take back responsibility for this and really start to think about what can be rescued and where do we
Yeah. Before they can do that, I think they need to understand that because they've all been so busy, I don't know if that's kind of their marketing and press teams as well that have also, like, how often do you see an HR director saying anything publicly? They certainly don't talk to the press. If they do, it's under a different name. It's really kind of cloak and dagger. Like, these people should be able to talk to the press about things like redundancies, right? But they're not allowed to because the organisation that they work for big organisations, says, we don't want to be connected to a negative story.
Yeah.
So they've basically, and if everyone does that, then you end up with the mess that we have now. So they're going to have to sort of say, okay, but for the greater good, we do need to talk about this stuff. There's one guy, a chap called Neil Morrison, who's the group HR director at Severn Trent, the water company. I do not give him a hard time when I talk to him about sewage, because he's doing a great job in HR and he's the only person who will speak up. But we should not have a situation where it's basically just Neil who's able to talk about this stuff because he happens to have press and marketing under his remit. They need to start talking. They're very bright. They know about companies, how companies work from the inside. The smart people know where this has gone wrong. But what I really want to do, I'm not quite sure what the product is yet, but this isn't working, is becoming a sort of brand in itself. If we could start to do events where we bring HR people to talk to each other, or we bring senior people like Neil, there are a few others emerging now, to talk to each other about, where have we gone wrong with this? You can talk about this stuff without going like, oh my God, we screwed this up so badly. They're never going to say that, but they're going to say, should we go back and reassess, whether this is still working properly and blah blah blah. There's a very corporate way of approaching this stuff. I'm just all about talking. I mean, I talk about the corporate world a lot, which might be annoying to people not from that world, but the corporate world I think is really interesting because they will always lead the way out.
Yes.
Because profit is the driver.
Yeah.
And you don't have that in the public sector. You have to have other things be the driver. And in the charity sector and the arts sector and universities, the funding model is different. So that allows them to drift further away from the core of what they're supposed to be doing. In the corporate world, you come back to go woke, go broke, and suddenly it's very clear that you've got this wrong. If your customers hate it, you've got it wrong. Also, I think they're realizing now that it's not just what your customers think. I think the biggest self-inflicted wound from any of this stuff is on your own workforce. I think we're going to, when the dawn breaks on all this stuff, we're going to realize that they've lost a lot of their really good people. They've lost a lot of their middle-aged women as well. The sensible people have gone. Sometimes when I look at the footage from some of those employment tribunals, like the one with the Met Police or Sandy Peggy up in Scotland, I think, oh my God, how did this go so wrong? How has this got to employment tribunal? And I realised that it's because the sensible people have left those organisations. The sensible people just left over the last 3-5 years. You're not seeing that in the corporate world anymore. Those employment tribunals aren't happening.
Yeah. So is that the solution then, is let's get the sensible people back?
Yes, I think it is. I think so. I'm self-identifying as the sensible people.
Yeah.
And the people that come on my podcast are the sensible people. I'm not gonna interview mad people like for balance.
Yeah.
Like, no.
How do we
here are some good lawyers, I'm gonna get some bad lawyers on just to get no.
So if things go well in this regard and in 10 years' time a lot of the sensible people have returned to the room, how do we measure success?
Well, it couldn't be any worse than this. If it's better than this, I mean,
I'm going to say productivity.
Yeah, productivity. From an HR perspective, you've got to look at productivity. I think you've also got to look at retention. I think they've not been looking enough at who is leaving and why they're leaving. So you want to get your retention up, your attrition down. I'm not totally sure about workforce kind of employee satisfaction type. I think there are better ways to measure how happy your staff are than like asking them how happy they are. Do they stay? Yeah. It's a good thing. Are they productive? So I think, I mean, there's a lot of questions about whether any of this stuff has done any good for businesses. So I think we probably need some better indicators of how we know if your company's working or not working, or, not even company, if it's, it could be public sector.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell are you actually doing as an organization? And that will differ from organization to organization. So, I don't know. I mean, if you're a theatre, for example, or a bowling alley, like, how do you measure success of your organization? You're going to have different ideas versus if you're a charity. I think we've just wandered so far away from the core of what every organisation was originally for. And I also think, I mean, I was struck, I was listening to your interview with Claire Fox, who I think is fab, about, she was talking about the House of Lords being there to assess the kind of unintended consequences of bills that were sort of going, is it bills? I'm not very good at stuff, you guys know the detail, before they pass into law. And I think employers need to have a better way of thinking about unintended consequences before they just go all in with stuff. And I don't know what that would be. And I don't know if that's something that we can do as an industry rather than letting everyone do it separately, but have much better ways of checking unintended consequences and then checking before we go all in, so we just put better roadblocks in, so hopefully things don't get quite out of control again. I mean, this is an industry that is very susceptible to fads, and I think that's been a big part of what's gone wrong here. And I think we need a better social mix as well. Is really interesting. The corporate world's good because it's got a better social mix as well.
Yeah, and unintended consequences impact assessment is what we need.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to predict unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I think I've always had this thing, right, that I think people like me are quite good at unintended consequences, and probably Claire is too. Some people are just good at spotting like that won't work or that might not work.
Yeah.
And I think we've been sort of shamed and silenced as being like negative.
Yeah.
When actually we're just really good at seeing problems before they happen. It's just like a superpower, right? If you say to me that I can't mention a problem I can see with that plan unless I can come up with a solution, I haven't got a solution. So I'm just going to not tell you that there's a huge iceberg on the horizon,
Yeah.
and I'm just going to wait for you to hit it. Whereas if I said, I've been thinking about this, and I think we haven't thought that through, and I think there's a risk of this. Between us, we can come up with a solution.
Absolutely, collectively, yes.
We don't need to be shaming people for being able to spot problems or vocalizing problems. I think the minute we reframed problems as challenges. Do you remember when that happened?
I do.
It's so weird. I think that was when that should have been a sign that we were going wrong. If we're not even allowed to call them problems, guys, I think this is not good.
I do date everything back to when we ditched personnel and started using HR.
Right. Oh my God, I know.
That was fantastic, that, Tanya. I think we've really benefited from your experience there. If anybody doesn't yet listen to This Isn't Working, Tanya's podcast, please do follow that, as well as following us, subscribing and recommending to your friends and giving us 5-star reviews.
Indeed, 6 stars if possible.
Oh, of course. And thanks again, Tanya. Really fantastic to hear from you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
See you next week, everybody.
Cheers for listening.